Hospitals, places of life, death, and often secrets that never come to light. When the lights go out and the hallways become empty, it is in this silence that something strange begins to happen. Every year, more and more people claim to have experienced inexplicable phenomena within these places, where the unexpected and the supernatural seem to meet. In this video, we'll explore 5 horror stories that took place in hospitals, places where science and medicine should be the only answers. However, there is something more to these hospitals, something that defies logical explanation. If you've ever felt uneasy or had an unexplainable experience in a hospital, prepare yourself. These stories will leave you wondering, could there be more than just medicine in these cold, impersonal hallways? Before we start, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any terrifying stories like this. It was a cold night at St. Vincent's Hospital, and the halls were eerily quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of machines and the occasional footstep of a nurse passing by. In the emergency room, a new patient was being wheeled in on a gurney, his skin pale and his body completely still. His heart rate monitor flatlined before he even reached the door. The paramedics tried their best to revive him, but after several minutes, it seemed hopeless. The doctors exchanged worried glances, each one silently agreeing that they'd done everything they could. "He's gone," said Dr. Anderson, the attending physician, his voice low and somber. "Let's call it." As the nurses began to remove the tubes and wires from the body, something inexplicable happened. The patient's chest rose, just a slight movement as if a breath had been taken. The nurses froze, their eyes wide in disbelief. They rushed to check the monitor again, and to everyone's shock, it showed a faint but steady heartbeat. A gasp escaped from one of the nurses. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. The patient was alive, but only barely. His vital signs were weak and irregular, fluctuating between normal and completely flat. Dr. Anderson, confused, ordered more tests. "Get an IV in him and keep him on constant monitoring. This isn't right." For hours, the patient remained unconscious, his heartbeat wavering like a candle's flame in the wind. But just when they thought they were getting a grip on the situation, something even stranger occurred. The room's temperature suddenly plummeted. A sharp, biting cold swept through the sterile white walls, chilling everyone to the bone. The nurses glanced at one another, unsure of what was happening, but they were too busy to question it. The patient's condition was deteriorating, and they couldn't afford distractions. Then, just as suddenly as the temperature dropped, the patient's vital signs began to stabilize, at least for a moment. Dr. Anderson, unable to comprehend what was going on, leaned in closer to check the patient's eyes. The moment his face was just inches from the patient's, the man's eyes snapped open. But they weren't the eyes of a living person. They were cold, glassy, and lifeless. Dr. Anderson stepped back, his heart racing. His hands trembled as he looked down at the man, unsure of what to do next. The patient's mouth opened, but no sound came out, at least not at first. Then, a faint whisper, "Help me." Dr. Anderson's blood ran cold. That was impossible. The man was supposed to be dead. There was no medical explanation for what was happening. "What the hell is going on here?" one of the nurses whispered, her voice shaky. The next few hours were a blur of confusion. The patient's heart rate would fluctuate. Sometimes it was as if he were alive. Other times he would flatline again. Yet every time they thought he was gone, his eyes would snap open. His mouth would whisper in a language none of them could understand. The staff couldn't explain it, and worse still, no one could trace the patient's identity. There was no record of him entering the hospital, no documents, no one who could identify him. As the night went on, a strange thing happened. The moment the patient's body flatlined for good, his form seemed to fade. It wasn't like death. The body didn't remain. It just vanished. One moment, he was lying there on the gurney, and the next, there was nothing but an empty bed, the sheets untouched. "Where did he go?" Dr. Anderson muttered to himself. His voice was thick with dread, and his hands gripped the edge of the gurney, knuckles white. "This isn't possible." The nurses searched the entire hospital. They checked every room, every corridor, even the morgue, but there was no sign of the patient. He had completely disappeared. There were no explanations, no clues, just an unsettling feeling that something beyond the ordinary had happened that night. The strange disappearance of the patient was only the beginning of the unsettling events happening in the hospital. But was it an isolated incident? Or were there deeper, more sinister forces at play? As we move forward, we'll dive into room 404, where the hospital's darkest secrets begin to unravel. It was a quiet afternoon when Nurse Emily was assigned to monitor room 404. It wasn't a usual shift for her. Room 404 had a reputation. Most staff avoided it, and there were whispers that the room was cursed. It wasn't because of the patients, it was the events that surrounded them. Over the years, multiple patients had been admitted to that room, only to mysteriously disappear or be found dead under unexplainable circumstances. Emily wasn't superstitious, but something about the room always gave her chills. Still, it was her duty. As she walked through the sterile, flickering lights of the hallway, she reached room 404, its door creaking open with an eerie sound. Inside, the room was as normal as any other. Bare white walls, a hospital bed, and the steady beeping of medical equipment. The patient lying in the bed appeared to be in a deep coma, his face pale and unresponsive. His name was Robert Mitchell, a middle-aged man who had been in a car accident. The doctors had done everything they could, but he showed no signs of recovery. The doctors were skeptical, unsure whether he would ever wake up. Emily checked the IV drip, adjusted the patient's position, and wrote down his vitals. As she did, she noticed something strange. There was a chill in the room that hadn't been there before. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and her breath began to form visible clouds in the air. "Strange," Emily murmured, reaching for the thermostat to turn the heat up, but it wasn't working. The cold persisted. A sharp, uncomfortable shiver ran down her spine, but she tried to ignore it. Just then, she noticed something else. Robert's fingers twitched. A faint, barely noticeable movement, but it was enough to make her pause. She quickly checked the monitor, but there was no change. His heart rate remained stable, and his vitals were normal. Maybe she had imagined it. But then, his eyes slowly opened. They were wide, blank, and unblinking. But they weren't the eyes of someone who had just woken from a coma. They were cold, empty, as though there was nothing behind them. Emily's heart began to race. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer to the bed. "Mr. Mitchell," she whispered, her voice shaking. No response. She reached for his hand, but the moment her fingers touched his skin, a jolt of cold electricity shot through her, sending a wave of panic through her body. She quickly pulled her hand away, her pulse pounding in her ears. The patient's eyes remained fixed on her, but there was something terrifying in them, something unnatural. It was as if Robert wasn't truly there. Suddenly, the room grew even colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen. The machines started beeping wildly, but they didn't show any signs of an emergency. The lights flickered and then went out entirely, leaving the room in complete darkness. Emily fumbled for the light switch, but before she could find it, a loud crash echoed through the room. She spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing, just the ominous sound of heavy breathing, slow, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the bed. She turned back to the patient. His eyes had changed. Now, they weren't just empty, they were filled with something darker, something inhuman. The monitor went crazy, flashing warning signs as the heart rate spiked wildly. Emily stumbled back, terrified, but her feet wouldn't move. It felt like the room itself was closing in on her. The shadows seemed to stretch, curling around the bed, as though reaching for her. In a panic, she slammed her hand against the wall, searching for the light switch. But the darkness consumed her. Just as she felt herself losing control, the lights came back on. The room was normal again, the temperature rising to a tolerable level. But the patient, Robert, was gone. The bed was empty. The monitors read flat. She rushed out of the room, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. She had to tell someone. Someone needed to know. But when she ran to the nurse's station, the other staff just stared at her, their faces blank. No one acknowledged her panic. The room had been empty for hours, they said. Robert Mitchell had never even been admitted that day. What was it about room 404 that caused these bizarre occurrences? Was it something more sinister than just an old, forgotten hospital room? As we move on to the next story, we'll explore a hospital wing that's said to be a gateway to something beyond our understanding. Dr. Robert Ellis was known for his skill, precision, and expertise in the field of surgery. His reputation had earned him the trust of the hospital's most respected medical staff. But on one cold winter night, something happened that would forever change the way the hospital staff viewed him. It started with a routine operation. A young woman, Sarah Williams, was admitted for a simple procedure, a routine appendectomy. There was nothing remarkable about the case, but Sarah's anxiety was palpable. She had heard rumors of a strange surgeon who operated late at night, someone who was said to perform miraculous surgeries, but with an unsettling presence. Dr. Ellis entered the operating room at precisely 11:45 p.m. His face was calm, his movements deliberate, but there was something about him that made the air in the room feel heavy. The nurses tried to ignore their unease, knowing that Dr. Ellis was a professional. They prepped the patient and went through the usual checks before the anesthesia took effect. As Sarah drifted into unconsciousness, she could hear the faint sounds of the surgical tools clinking and the murmurs of the medical staff. But as the operation progressed, something strange occurred. The room, which had been brightly lit moments ago, suddenly began to flicker. The lights dimmed and then flickered again, as if the electricity was unstable. Nurse Rebecca, one of the staff members in the operating room, glanced nervously at Dr. Ellis. He didn't seem to notice the flickering lights or the growing tension in the room. He was completely focused on his work, as though nothing in the world could distract him. But then the lights went out entirely. For a few moments, there was nothing but darkness, the sound of Sarah's steady breathing, and the faint hum of the ventilator. The nurses fumbled for flashlights, their hands trembling. "Dr. Ellis, should we call maintenance?" Rebecca asked, her voice quivering. No response. They turned to find Dr. Ellis standing at the operating table, his hands still moving with surgical precision. But when the light from the flashlights finally illuminated his face, something was wrong. His features were pale, almost ghostly. His eyes, which had been sharp and focused before, were now wide open, staring into nothingness. His face was expressionless, devoid of any emotion. And his hands, they were no longer human. The fingers, once normal, had elongated, twisting and contorting as though they were made of something far more sinister. They looked like they belonged to something otherworldly. Rebecca's blood ran cold as she stared at Dr. Ellis, unable to move, her legs frozen to the floor. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. casting the room in bright, fluorescent light. Dr. Ellis stood perfectly still, his hands normal once more, his face now calm, almost serene. He looked at Rebecca as if nothing had happened, as if he had not just undergone an unnerving transformation. "Everything's fine," he said softly, his voice smooth, as though there had been no interruption. "Let's continue with the procedure." The nurses exchanged uneasy glances. It felt as if time had warped in that moment. But, as professionals, they followed Dr. Ellis's lead and resumed their duties. The rest of the operation proceeded as if nothing unusual had occurred. After the surgery, Sarah was moved to the recovery room and everything appeared to go smoothly. However, when Sarah woke up, her first words were strange and unsettling. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Where is the surgeon?" Rebecca tried to reassure her. "You've just had surgery, Sarah. Dr. Ellis was the one who performed the operation. He's the best we have." But Sarah's eyes widened in terror. "No, it wasn't him. It wasn't Dr. Ellis, the surgeon who worked on me. He wasn't human." Rebecca froze, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" He had eyes like glass, and his hands," Sarah shuddered. "His hands weren't human. They were like claws." Confused and deeply unsettled, Rebecca tried to calm Sarah down, but the young woman refused to believe it was Dr. Ellis. Sarah insisted that the surgeon who had performed her surgery wasn't the same man she had seen earlier. As days passed, strange things began happening throughout the hospital. Nurses and doctors would report seeing Dr. Ellis walking through the halls late at night, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. But when they approached him, he would disappear into thin air, vanishing as if he were nothing more than a shadow. Some said they saw him standing in the operating room, his ghostly figure hovering over the surgical table. Others claimed they heard whispers in the empty halls, soft, chilling whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. But whenever anyone tried to confront him, Dr. Ellis would be gone, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of dread. Was he a ghost, a figment of their imagination? Or was something more sinister at play in the depths of the hospital? Dr. Ellis's eerie presence wasn't the only disturbing force haunting the hospital. In the next story, we'll explore a patient who vanished without a trace, and the dark secret lurking in the basement of the very same hospital. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon when an emergency case came in. A patient named Mark Peterson, a young man who had been found unconscious in a local park. He had suffered severe head trauma after an unknown assault, and his injuries were extensive. His condition was critical, and it seemed like his chances of survival were slim. The hospital staff rushed to stabilize him, hooking him up to life support machines and administering high doses of painkillers. Dr. Simmons, a seasoned trauma surgeon, took charge of the case, but even he knew there wasn't much hope. "His vitals are too weak. We'll need to prepare for the worst," Dr. Simmons said grimly, staring at the monitor as Mark's heart rate began to stabilize, but only just. The nurses worked quickly, trying to keep Mark comfortable and monitoring his condition. Despite their best efforts, Mark's body seemed to fight back against the medical intervention. His pulse was erratic, and he was slipping in and out of consciousness, though he never truly seemed to wake up. But then, something truly strange happened. As the hours passed, Mark began to mumble. His voice was barely audible, and at first the nurses assumed he was speaking in his sleep. But his words were fragmented and nonsensical until one word caught their attention. "Help!" The nurse closest to the bed, Amanda, leaned in, her ear near his lips, straining to hear. "What did you say?" she asked gently. Mark mumbled again, and Amanda's blood ran cold. Don't let them find me." A chill ran down Amanda's spine, and she quickly checked the monitors. Mark's vitals were still unstable, but his heart rate had slightly increased. Was he conscious, or was this just a result of his brain activity? Then, without warning, Mark's eyes snapped open. But it wasn't just his eyes. His whole body jolted, as though he had been shocked awake. Amanda stepped back in shock as Mark's gaze locked onto hers, his pupils dilated unnaturally wide, his face pale and expressionless. "You need to leave," Mark said suddenly, his voice sharp yet hollow. The words didn't seem to fit with the condition he had been in just moments before. Amanda hesitated. "What do you mean? You're safe now, Mark. We're here to help you." "No one is safe here," Mark muttered, his voice trembling as he clutched the edge of the bed with both hands. His body was convulsing, but his eyes never left Amanda's. "What's happening to me?" he asked, almost pleading. Before Amanda could respond, the lights in the room flickered. The temperature dropped sharply, and a feeling of dread settled in the air. It wasn't just the cold that was unsettling. It was the oppressive silence that followed. Mark's breathing grew heavier, as though he was struggling for air. His hands gripped the sides of the bed so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Mark, we need to calm down," Amanda said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing sense of terror that surrounded her. Suddenly, Mark gasped. His chest heaved as though he was choking, and before Amanda could react, the machines went silent. The monitors showed a flat line. "No!" Amanda whispered, stepping back in shock. "No! This can't be happening!" She rushed to call for help, but before she could press the emergency button, the room was plunged into darkness. The silence was deafening, and Amanda's pulse raced as she fumbled for the light switch. Then, in the pitch-black room, something terrifying happened. A low whispering began to echo through the air, as though multiple voices were speaking at once. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound was unmistakable. It was as though someone or something was speaking directly to her. Her heart was pounding as she turned back to Mark's bed, but the bed was empty. Mark was gone. Amanda stood frozen in place, fear locking her body in place as she heard the faintest shuffle from behind her. Slowly, she turned around. The light flickered back on, revealing Mark standing at the foot of the bed, his eyes wide, but not the same eyes from moments before. These were not the eyes of a man who had just been on the brink of death. His body was different, hollow, unnatural. His movements were stiff, jerky, and his skin appeared to be fading, like a figure slowly disappearing. But the most terrifying part was his face. It was no longer the face of the man who had entered the hospital just hours ago. His features were distorted, almost skeletal, as though something else had taken his place. "Help me," Mark whispered in a voice that was no longer human. Amanda's knees buckled as she stumbled backward. Her eyes were wide with terror, and for a moment she couldn't comprehend what was happening. Mark was gone, yet here he stood, his form almost translucent, flickering in and out of existence. The door to the room opened suddenly, and two other nurses rushed in. When they saw Mark, they gasped and rushed toward him, but when they tried to touch him, their hands passed straight through his body. Mark's form flickered again like a bad TV signal. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Mark was gone, vanished into thin air, leaving only the cold emptiness in the room. Amanda stared at the empty bed, her breath shallow. What had just happened? Was Mark still alive? Or had she witnessed something far more disturbing than any of them could have imagined? The unsettling disappearances weren't over. As we continue, we'll uncover a chilling story of a patient who vanished from the ICU, leaving behind a cryptic message that only deepened the mystery of the hospital's dark past. The intensive care unit, ICU, was one of the busiest places in the hospital. The constant beeping of machines, the soft murmurs of medical staff, and the steady stream of patients fighting for their lives made the environment both tense and sterile. But there was something different about the ICU on the third floor of the hospital, a strange, unsettling atmosphere that seemed to hang in the air, lingering in the corners of the rooms, just out of sight. Nurse Emily had worked in the ICU for 5 years, and although she had seen her fair share of trauma and suffering, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that floor. It wasn't just the usual exhaustion and stress of the job. It was something deeper, something unexplainable. At first, she chalked it up to the normal paranoia that comes with long shifts, but as time went on, the feeling grew stronger. One night, Emily was assigned to a night shift, and like most of her shifts, it began uneventfully. The patients in the ICU were all critical, but stable. Emily moved from room to room, checking vitals, administering medications, and providing support to the families waiting anxiously outside the rooms. That was when she noticed the new patient. He was an older man, frail and thin, with pale skin and a distant, hollow gaze. His name was Charles Whitaker, and he had been admitted after suffering a stroke. The doctors had said his chances of recovery were slim, but Emily had seen patients in worse conditions pull through. There was still hope, she thought. But Charles was different. As Emily walked into his room to check on him, she immediately felt a chill. The air seemed colder in his room, despite the heater running. She shook it off and began adjusting his IV drip, checking his vitals. But something about his presence made her skin crawl. It wasn't just the cold, it was the way his eyes moved. He wasn't looking at her, but his eyes followed her every movement, as if he could see through her. His mouth was dry, cracked, but he didn't speak. He just stared. Emily adjusted his blanket and smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, Mr. Whitaker, you're in good hands," she said, her voice soothing. But Charles didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak, but steady. Emily moved on to check the other patients, but as she passed his room again, she noticed something strange. The door to his room was slightly ajar, and there was a faint sound coming from inside, a whisper. Curious, she pushed the door open. But there was no one inside. At least no one she could see. The room was empty, save for Charles, who was still lying in bed. But his eyes were wide open, and his mouth was moving in silent whispers. Emily couldn't hear the words, but she could see his lips moving as though he were trying to speak. Frozen, she stepped forward, reaching out to touch his shoulder, but as soon as her hand made contact, she felt something cold and wet against her skin. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, like something otherworldly. She pulled her hand back, staring at the cold, clammy sensation lingering on her fingers. Before she could react, the monitors beeped erratically, flashing red. Charles' heart rate spiked, and his breathing became frantic. The silence in the room was deafening as Emily frantically grabbed the phone to call for help. But before she could reach for the intercom, Charles' voice broke through the silence. "Get out!" he rasped, his voice weak and trembling. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Mr. Whitaker?" she asked, stepping back from the bed. But Charles' eyes were now wide, unblinking. His hands twitched as though he were trying to sit up, but his body refused to move. "Get out! They're here!" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily felt a strange unease flood her body. She had heard stories before about patients who had strange premonitions or claimed to see things others couldn't. But this was different. The sense of dread in the room was overwhelming. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut, and the lights flickered. Emily gasped, her pulse racing. She tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on it, but the sound echoed strangely, as if it were coming from a different place entirely. Charles's breathing grew more rapid, and his body began to convulse. His eyes were wide with terror, staring at something beyond Emily, something she couldn't see. "Please, help me," he whispered, his voice cracking. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and Emily's throat tightened as she continued to struggle with the door. Just as she thought she might suffocate from the weight of fear pressing on her chest, the door swung open suddenly, and the lights flickered back to life. Emily rushed out of the room, gasping for air. The monitors stopped flashing, and Charles's vitals returned to normal. But the feeling of terror had not left her. It clung to her like an invisible shadow, following her every step. The next morning, when Emily checked on Charles, he was gone. The bed was empty, the monitors showed no sign of a struggle, and the room appeared as if nothing had happened. But there was something different, something that made Emily's blood run cold. On the nightstand by the bed there was a single note, scrawled hastily in dark ink. It read, "They are coming. You can't stop them." The strange disappearances and cryptic messages were not isolated incidents. As we move forward, we'll dive deeper into the secrets of the hospital, where an even darker truth waits to be uncovered in the shadow of the ICU. The events in the ICU had unsettled Nurse Emily, but she wasn't the only one feeling the weight of something dark hanging over the hospital. The strange occurrences had begun to spread to other floors, with more staff and patients reporting disturbing experiences. It was as if the hospital had become a place where the boundaries between life and death were no longer so clear. Emily, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, decided to look deeper into the history of the hospital. She'd worked there long enough to know that every hospital had its secrets, but this place seemed to hold far more than its fair share. The hospital had been established over a century ago, originally as a small community clinic. But over the decades, it had expanded, becoming a large medical center with state-of-the-art equipment. The staff had always prided themselves on their cutting-edge technology and compassionate care. But hidden beneath this facade was a much darker past. One evening, Emily went to the hospital archives, a dusty room located in the basement. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, and the dim light flickered above her as she combed through the files. She was looking for any hint, any record that could explain the strange happenings she had witnessed. She didn't expect to find much, just old patient files, standard reports and documents, but what she uncovered was something far more chilling. There was an old file buried at the back of a drawer, labeled simply Project 13. Emily pulled it out, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The file was filled with cryptic notes, research papers, and photographs. The first page contained a brief summary of the project, which was initiated in the 1950s. It had been led by Dr. Samuel Graves, a well-known neurologist at the time. The project was supposed to be a cutting-edge study on brain function and the afterlife. The hospital at that time was known for experimenting with new treatments and therapies, some of them controversial. According to the notes, Dr. Graves believed that the human consciousness could survive death. He theorized that with the right combination of technology and psychological manipulation, he could help patients connect with the afterlife before they passed. The project, however, was shrouded in secrecy, and the notes hinted at unethical experiments. There were mentions of patients being put into a deep, induced coma and being kept alive for extended periods. But the most disturbing part of the file were the photographs, distorted images of patients who appeared to be in some kind of trance, their faces twisted in terror. As Emily flipped through the pages, she found an entry that chilled her to the bone. It read, Patient 13. Subject appears to have encountered an unknown entity. Subject's brainwaves indicate the presence of something non-human. We have lost contact with the patient. Emily's heart raced as she read the note over and over again. Patient 13, was this the origin of the hospital's dark history? And the unknown entity that was mentioned, was it connected to the strange disappearances, the whispers, and the ghostly visions? The more she read, the clearer it became. This project had been a catastrophic failure. Dr. Graves was never heard from again, and the project was quietly shut down. But the notes hinted that the experiments had continued in secret, long after the official end. A knock at the door startled Emily, and she quickly stuffed the file back into the drawer, hoping no one had seen her. It was one of the hospital administrators, Mrs. Vance, who stood in the doorway, her face stern. "Emily, what are you doing down here?" Mrs. Vance asked, her tone sharp. Emily forced a smile, trying to appear casual. "I was just looking for some old files. I thought I could help with the upcoming audits." Mrs. Vance raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Well, whatever it is you're looking for, make sure you don't dig too deep. There are some things around here that are better left forgotten." Her words hung in the air like a warning. Emily nodded, feeling a knot form in her stomach. She didn't want to draw any more attention to herself, but now she knew something more about the hospital's history, something that explained the strange occurrences. As she left the archives, Emily's mind raced. Project 13 had been about communication with something beyond life, something that wasn't human. She couldn't ignore the implications. What if the hospital had been built on this dark foundation, a place where the lines between the living and the dead were blurred? And what if the patients who had died in these experiments were still here, lingering in the shadows, trapped between life and death? Emily needed to know more. She couldn't let this go. The answers were somewhere within the hospital, hidden deep in its walls. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp ringing of the hospital intercom. It was a message for all staff to report immediately to the ICU. The message was calm, but the urgency in the voice left Emily uneasy. "Code Blue in ICU, room 312, immediate assistance required." Without hesitation, Emily ran towards the ICU, her heart pounding. Was this just another emergency, or was something more sinister at play? As she neared the ICU, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap set long ago by Project 13. As Emily reaches the ICU, she senses that something truly horrific is about to unfold. What she discovers in room 312 will bring everything together, exposing the horrifying truth about the hospital's dark history. The end is near, but the mystery is far from over. The halls of the ICU were eerily silent as Emily approached room 312. The code blue alert had been called, but the atmosphere felt off in a way that went beyond the usual emergency response. The lights flickered above her, casting long shadows along the sterile white walls. The air seemed heavy, thick, with an unease that Emily couldn't quite place. Every step she took seemed to echo, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. As she pushed open the door to room 312, the first thing she noticed was the stark coldness of the room. It was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. The monitors were flashing wildly, their beeping fast and frantic, but the patient in the bed was motionless. It was a young woman named Sarah, who had been admitted just days ago following a serious car accident. Her condition had been critical, but she had shown signs of improvement, until now. The strange thing was that no one could explain why her heart rate was spiking so suddenly. There were no signs of physical trauma, no indication that anything had worsened. Emily approached the bed cautiously, her eyes scanning the room for any clues. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the whispering that she had heard in the ICU earlier seemed to grow louder, though no one else was in the room. Then she saw it, at the foot of Sarah's bed. Standing in the shadowed corner of the room was a figure, a tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow, dark eyes that seemed to peer into her very soul. The figure was so still, it almost seemed like a part of the room itself, but Emily felt an undeniable chill creeping up her spine. "Who are you?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the beeping of the monitors. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching. Suddenly, the woman in the bed gasped for air, her body convulsing violently. The monitors began to flash red, and the once peaceful beep of her heart rate monitor turned into a rapid, erratic rhythm. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she rushed to Sarah's side, trying to stabilize her. But no matter how much she adjusted the IV or checked her vitals, the woman's body wouldn't respond. In a panic, Emily looked around the room for help, but she was alone. The figure in the corner remained motionless, its eyes never leaving Sarah. The whispering grew louder, more intense, until it felt like the very walls were closing in on her. "Get away from her!" Emily shouted, stepping in front of Sarah, as if she could shield the patient from whatever this figure was. But the words seemed to have no effect. The figure stepped closer, moving unnaturally, as if gliding across the floor, silent and smooth. Its presence was suffocating, and Emily could feel the air growing colder with each passing second. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, and everything in the room went black. When Emily opened her eyes, she found herself in the same room, but it was different. The bed was empty, the monitors were dead, and the whispering had stopped. The figure was gone, but a new presence lingered in the air. Emily stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure if she was awake or trapped in some sort of nightmare. But then Sarah's voice broke the silence. "Help me." Sarah's voice was weak, barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Emily turned quickly, only to find Sarah sitting up in the bed, her eyes wide and empty. There was no sign of life in her gaze, no recognition of the world around her. "Sarah?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. But Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she began to laugh, a cold, hollow laugh that echoed through the empty room. It was a laugh that didn't belong to a human being, a laugh that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of suffering and darkness. "You shouldn't have come here," Sarah's voice whispered, but it wasn't Sarah speaking anymore. It was something else, something that had taken hold of her body, her soul. "They're all here, trapped, waiting." The air grew colder still, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The room around her seemed to distort, the walls closing in, the lights flickering in and out of existence. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. Emily was no longer in the ICU. She was back in the archives, holding the file for Project 13. The walls were crumbling, the air thick with dust and decay. The photographs of the patients from the 1950s hung on the walls, their eyes lifeless and cold. She turned to see Dr. Samuel Graves standing in the corner, his face pale and drawn. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He was pointing towards the doorway, as if urging her to leave. But Emily didn't move. And then, just like that, she was back in room 312. The whispering had stopped. The figure was gone. But the truth was clear. The hospital, built on the foundation of Project 13, was cursed. The patients who had been experimented on were still here, their souls trapped between life and death. The afterlife that Dr. Graves had sought to communicate with wasn't peaceful. It was a prison. The entity that haunted the hospital was not a spirit. but something far darker, a force that fed on the suffering of the living and the dead. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Sarah's lifeless body. There was no escaping the truth now. The hospital wasn't just haunted, it was a place where the dead never truly left. And as Emily stepped out of the room, she realized that she too was now part of this curse. There was no way to escape. The whispering voices were all around her now. What happened to Emily? Did she escape the curse of the hospital, or is she forever trapped in the dark, haunted corridors with the voices of the past closing in on her? If you enjoyed this terrifying tale, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more spine-chilling stories from the world's most haunted places. And if you dare, share your own creepy experiences with us in the comments below. The darkness is always closer than you think.